Welcome back, and we're getting ready to move into our first conversation for today. We are joined by Darren Lumpkin, who is a technical consultant for the Early Childhood Development Project. We have Denise Roberto, who is the Program Officer for Early Childhood Development and Education at UNICEF Belize. And we have John Newport, who is the Director of Quality Assurance Development Services in the Ministry of Education, Youth, Sports and Culture. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Now we're focusing once again on the importance of childhood development, early childhood development, and specifically the Care for Child Development initiatives that are taking place. I want to start off with kind of just setting the backdrop once again as to why focusing on children of this specific age is so important for us in Belize. Let's start with you, Denise.
Okay. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Sani, for having us on the show. And I just want to say that the government of Belize has been doing quite a lot in terms of investment in early childhood. And when we look at early childhood, we are talking about the child from birth to 8 years old. Research has shown that early investment in children shows great benefits later on. And it speaks to the fact that even when the child is young, up until 2 years old, we have fast, rapid development of the brain taking place. And it shows that early stimulation, parent, adult, child interaction with the child at that point in time gives great feedbacks and benefits, because then the child may be healthy, the child will grow stronger, the child will develop quickly in terms of cognitive development, in terms of emotional, social interactions. So UNICEF has been really promoting and advocating for early investment in children. And because of that, the government of Belize has recently just started to implement an early childhood development policy. And the great thing about it is that the three ministries in the social sector, the ministries representing education, health and social development, human development, are working together across the sectors to increase the investment for children in early childhood.
Now let's look at what the indicators are in terms of success for this. First of all, education is the easiest area to find out enrollment in any kind of daycare or preschool program. And once upon a time, Belize wasn't doing so well. Where are we now in terms of enrollment of children in preschool programs?
Okay, if we think of preschool as being aimed at 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and if you're splitting that, there's a difference in the amount of enrollment we're seeing in those two age cohorts, with more 4-year-olds attending preschool than 3-year-olds. With the Ministry of Education, we are aiming over the next few years to get maybe up to 90-95% of 4-year-olds into preschools, or if not into a preschool center, into a situation where they're having some kind of structured, formal input from a professional educator. Some of that is buildings. So for example, tomorrow there's an inauguration of 3 new preschools. There's a ceremony in Trial Farm, because without the buildings it's difficult to see how you're going to expand the preschool sector. I think we have looked at attaching preschools to primary schools, and where that is possible it has been largely done. Also, we need to look at engaging more with the private sector preschool, the small preschool, which is basically run as a small business, which is in some countries where the majority of preschool places are allocated. But I think right now we are moving upwards from around 60% of children attending preschool, aiming for 80%, and then beyond that.
Allow me to reflect just on one issue, because once upon a time, and I know in my childhood, there was a kindergarten associated with all primary schools. and that was changed to entry level at infant 1. Are we now reverting back to that process, to having a built-in beginner, it used to be called beginners in school programs?
It's not a reversion, but we are certainly looking at the purpose of infant 1 and the experience the child will have in infant 1. I think that there's genuine agreement that infant 1, which is 5-year-olds, has become a little too academic. That there's been a failure to understand that academic flourishing does depend on having the right social and emotional environment. You have to have a nurturing environment. If you're formalizing education too early, the children will not have the space to explore and to grow and to make the brain connections that Denise was talking about. But infant 1 is the mandatory first year of education. It is therefore extremely important year in our education system, and one where I think over the next few years we'll be looking at rethinking and retraining teachers. So there is this more nurturing environment for the 5-year-old, which is different from what you're seeing at preschool. So I think
which brings me to this question. I'm glad that you're going in that direction. What is the difference between the 3-year-old being enrolled versus the 4-year-old if you're looking at 1 year, one calendar year, so to speak?
You're asking about there's two different ways of looking at that. I think from a policy angle, we have to ask the question, do we spend resources trying to make sure that as close to 100% of 4-year-olds are having a preschool experience, which means you then really have to focus on nationwide, all the villages, all the towns, every child? Or do you try simultaneously to bring up the number of 3-year-olds and number of 4-year-olds, which might have the impact of increasing the number of 3-year-olds in a preschool, but then still failing to touch 30% of 4-year-olds? So I think the first part of the answer to that is, although it's important that every child has as much preschool exposure as they can, it is very important that every 4-year-old gets the experience. Within that, there are clear changes in the way children behave, in the way they interact with each other, in their brain development, that requires slightly different techniques from a 3-year-old to a 4-year-old. But having said all that, what is key, and we keep going back to this, is the correct environment.
Yeah.
It is the preschool teacher as someone who nurtures,
Yeah.
Who provides a space where the child can explore safely, but in ways which are creative and flexible. And then understanding that within that setting, you're giving every single child, no matter their characteristics or stage of development, a chance to thrive by finding out things for themselves.
And that's interesting because, I think for parents who invest in getting their child into a preschool program, many of them do their homework, they go in, they see what the schools are like, and many are looking for a school that is very academic, that will ensure that their children know how to write and read and memorize certain, whether it's alphabet or numbers. But it's more than being able to acquire these specific skills. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
Well, I think, with this working with parents, and now I'm going to try to link it to the 0 to 3, what we know from science and neurodevelopment, the importance of the 0 to 3 period is critical. And so part of that is as John's talking about, having, for children 3 and 4, that they have more of a stimulating, a creative environment. And we see this happen where you go into a preschool or daycare when they're 3 and they have them sitting down trying to do academic, which is just really, out of touch with what really should be going on. But what's important is that with the brain development and the importance of 0 to 3 is family involvement. Yeah. And I've worked in this field for many years in Latin America and Caribbean. It used to be the early stimulation. It was a combination of activities. And what we're learning now is that in addition to that is how you use the daily activities to work with the child, where you're bathing the child, or if the mother is working or somebody else working, to talk with the child, to include the child. And it's not when they're 3 years old, but when they're born. You know, how do you work with the children and provide this environment? Because with the brain development and the foundation that they need for the future, it doesn't start when they walk into school. It starts really, you know, even before birth. So that I think this is important, that the parent involvement and the parent understanding, and that's part of, I think, the richness of what's happening in Belize, is the different ministries working together. As you look at across the life cycle, and each ministry has a role or responsibility as a leader, and the other reinforcing, you know, what they're doing.
And that, I think, is why the Ministry of Education is so engaged in this process. Is we've shifted from seeing, like, children didn't used to exist for the Ministry of Education until they turned up at school. And now there's a real understanding that the years before the child comes to school are laying a foundation, and that if that foundation is not constructed, we're already having to remediate and catch up and deal with risk even when the child is of a preschool or primary school age. And so the message of how you interact with a young child, and ensuring there's a responsiveness and it's a back and forth, and that it is, you know, the new science of how important it is the way the adult responds to the child in a way which is responsive, and what we call the serve and return is critical to later academic success.
So let's look at that specific area, because I think that's where the paradigm shift has to take place, where parents at home need to recognize that even before the preschool, before infant one, their interaction with from their newborn, or I should actually say from the fetus, right up until their first day of school, is important. And it's not about treating them like a baby that doesn't understand. It's about communicating with them at a level that they can be communicated. How do we teach this to parents?
Well, actually, what the course is starting today is very much in line with this of working with those who work with parents in terms of training and preparing and counseling, so that they increase their observation skills in terms of communication. And I know a long time ago, you know, when a child would cry, people said, well, you know, don't attend, you don't want to spoil the child. But the child, you know, has different forms of communicating, the baby, and one is crying. And so part of the work we're saying in terms of looking at the signals that the baby's doing, the crying, is that parents begin to understand, you know, the child communicating. And so this being responsive, being sensitive to what's going on in terms of being responsive is critical. And that really starts, you know, at birth. And that's part of the courses of using activities around communication and play, and working with parents so they begin to be able to observe, to read their children at the different stages of development.
And the idea as well is that basic things in the home can be used. And so we don't have to go and buy the expensive toys and the expensive books. But from the child is born, and even before, just talking to the child, singing with the child, and interacting with the child is important. So how do you interact? And really we look at the different stages of development for the child. So if it's a newborn, of course, then, you know, doing a jigsaw puzzle will not work with the newborn, but singing with that baby, stroking, using just a soft cloth, and we have some different examples here. This is a sponge that you recognize that we used to wash up dishes with, but it's just symbolic of maybe a soft cloth, a soft rag, or something in the home that you can use to just stimulate the child. And in terms of this training, which is called Care for Child Development, we've found that interacting with the baby, whether he or she is sick, whether he or she is disabled, or vulnerable or marginalized in any other way, is very important. And so we don't want to just also neglect the sick child, or leave the child abandoned, because he or she is too fussy. There's a reason why. And so early childhood providers in the 3 different ministries are learning more about why it is important to communicate and play, and how do we do that.
So they have to be convinced almost first to impart the information on to parents.
That's correct.
I can imagine how the Ministry of Health is such an easy partner for this, because so many women do take their babies, so many parents do take their babies in for vaccinations, for checkups, and perhaps this is one of the encounters that this information can be passed on. Who all are involved in this current training that you're undertaking?
Okay. Well, definitely, you spoke about the Ministry of Health. We have midwives, public health nurses, also some technical officers within the ministry who will have the capacity to do further training with healthcare workers, for example. We have health educators as well. But we also have preschool teachers, leaders, representatives within the education sector. And then in the Ministry of Human Development, we have social workers and social mobilizers and other officers, civic coordinating officers who deal with parenting programs. And one such parenting program is the Roving Caregivers program. And so we have rovers who go into the community, especially in the rural areas. And we have rovers even in Southside Belize City who go into the homes and teach the mothers and teach the caregivers, fathers, whoever, how to stimulate and work with that child using the necessary ordinary things at home. This is a toilet paper roll. I'm sorry. And well, it's just covered with paper, but we can use this, and you know, the child can drop certain things in their clothespins or whatever. And it teaches different things, cognitive development and other
No, I
areas.
wouldn't want to think that we are either late or behind on this initiative, but in a sense, why are we just now implementing this sort of three-prong approach where you're looking at different agencies working together to achieve this end?
I'd actually think we're not behind, we're ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
We're ahead of where many countries are. But what you have to appreciate is the change in understanding at the scientific level is something that's only really happened in the last 10 to 15 years. If you go back 15 or 20 years, it was almost assumed that children's academic and cognitive development didn't really kick in until later. There's a new understanding. There's a new understanding of how beneficial it is to invest in young children for your future national development. And in fact, I think that Belize has been quite responsive to this new science and this new research. And a lot of the papers that we are reading were only published 2008, 2015. You know, it is very recent stuff. And we're taking advantage of the fact that within Belize we're a relatively small system. So we can quickly set up the interactions between the different ministries and begin to create the kind of intersectoral collaboration that in larger countries would maybe take 10, 15 years to get off the ground.
Now, Darren, let me tap into your expertise, because you pointed out that you have worked with early childhood across Latin America and the Caribbean for quite a number of years. What would you say has been recent findings or scientific evidence that has really changed or impacted the approach and importance of early childhood education or early childhood development?
Well, I think John brought up some points, and Denise, that I think the scientific evidence in terms of the importance, you know, of the early years in brain development. So I think that whole area has really helped out to emphasize that we don't wait until children walk into school. The second is I think there's a growing awareness too in terms of what it means in terms of multiple benefits. Not only is the child rights, but in terms of what it means economically for the country, what it means in terms of savings. I remember when I worked in Brazil in the early 90s, they talked about what was the cost of repetition. and the country was spending 2.6 or 2.1 billion dollars per year on kids repeating. So you begin to see, well, if you don't invest early and you don't prepare kids, you're going to pay for it. And so there's an economic aspect of this. The scientific, what it means in terms of the aspect dealing with violence, dealing with other issues. So we see the investment, and what we're learning now is the multiple evidence of why it's important. And I think what John was saying, in having had contact with Belize for many years, Belize is really moving forward. Now, it takes time for the ministries to find their link, their niche, and how they work together. What I think is critical is that there's been a consistent investment in this country. And I think what you're finding now, which is important, is how each ministry finds their role and who's leading the work, but how can the other sectors support? And talk about education, we talk about this. Like, for example, if you look at the health, if they find a child that's at risk, and health communicates with the roving caregivers in Toledo so that they can follow up, and they can look to see whether or not that there are books in the home which will lead then, in the future in terms of literacy. So when the ministries work together and each one sees the role of the others and how they can reinforce, it is an integrated package that benefits not only reduction of costs and the opportunity to go to scale, but also it's good for children, it's good for families.
There's one recent piece of research which I think is very important to do with the long-term impact of what's called toxic stress in young children. So basically now it is evident that if you have a child who is in a situation which is violent, or there's lots of shouting, or there's lots of other environmental causes of stress, and we're talking here young children, that releases chemicals into the brain that stop the brain from developing as it should, which then have an impact over how that child is going to learn throughout school. So it may not seem important right now that the people are fighting in front of young children and creating a stressful situation, but we now know, scientifically know, that the long-term impact of that on learning is significant. So it's like going back to making sure that all people who come into contact with young children understand the environment has to be child-friendly, whether that's the nurse, or whether that's the grandmother, or the father, the caregiver. And a lot of this, the more we read this research, the more we say we really have to pay attention to what is happening at the very early part of life.
And I know that also when you talk about brain development, in fact, the majority of the brain development takes place before a child enters the school system. And this really does put a large responsibility on parents in being able to buy into understanding the importance of early childhood development. So from the training that is taking place with your caretakers, with your frontline personnel and technical personnel, how do you see this trickling back into homes where the parents can learn these experiences?
Well, Marlene, most of those who are being trained, for example, will be able to deliver this at specific point of contacts where families come. For example, in the training there are field practice, and one of those will be at the clinics, for example, the Matron Roberts Polyclinic. And the practice and training and interaction will be directly with the young mothers or other caregivers who come with their child. And so it's going to take quite a while in terms of the national rollout. Initial training began, I think, in 2015, late 2015, and this is just the second training. But this is because now the government is saying we have a strategic plan to implement this, and we are going to see how we can operationalize activities in early childhood development on a whole among the different sectors. And so, for example, at the clinics, we will have families being trained. We have the daycare centers and the Inspiration Center and some other sites where parents come with their child, because the caregiver must do the stimulation and must interact with the child. It's not going to work if John or I go in and do it. You know, the families are the ones who are with their children every day.
We know you brought your props, and of course this is most important because I think people think it's expensive. You know, I think they have to go out and buy something specific for stimulation. But as you pointed out with the sponge and the toilet paper roll, anything at home can be used for stimulation.
Definitely, anything at home. I have here a stack of cups. And one of the activities that we do is stacking, and we encourage the mother or the caregiver, the father. And I must say that in our training, we do interact with a lot of fathers who come and who's like, oh, wow, you know, I'm getting this. That if I just sing with my child, I'm going to be having some sort of reaction.
Yeah.
And so we teach the child that stacking, and what is happening here is eye-hand coordination taking place, for example, with songs, with different objects. It gives a different sound, and it's also teaching the child to experiment. And so, for example, just let me say, if the child is banging stuff and dropping things on the floor, that child is not necessarily being rude.
Trying to hear the sound that the object makes.
The child is just developing, you know, and so we don't have to, we teach about regulation. You don't have to spank that child because she's making a lot of noise. There's a reason.
Okay. Well, anything else you'd like to say before we close off this segment?
I would just like to say that we didn't bring up the point of how this whole effort is important for children with disability and children that are at risk. And this is one of the areas that, if we know from the science the importance of early child development and stimulation for brain development, but especially for children that are at risk with a disability, if you don't start early, the impact is significant. And so that's one of the areas working, and I'm working in the regional level on the Zika and the impact of Zika. And we're certainly, we're going to have another workshop soon on how we link this up and working with children that are affected by Zika or other congenital malformations. So this is also critical for the work with children with disabilities.
Okay. Well, thank you for stopping in and sharing all this information, and hopefully parents at home who have a young one will be able to understand how important their role is in their child's development. Right? Thank you once again.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by the mother of Miss Belize Universe, Therese Rath, to talk about the recent tell-all published by her husband and the reactions so far. So stay tuned.